The dust from her husband's grave had barely settled on the dry, unforgiving plains of Arizona territory when the buzzards began circling, not in the sky but on the ground, wearing badges of men. For Grace Dawson, the silence left by her beloved husband Eli Boone was quickly replaced by the chilling whispers of Deputy Gus Ford. He didn't offer condolences. He offered an ultimatum. Marry him, or his made-up debts and legal threats would strip her of the Bishop Creek Ranch, the only piece of Eli she had left. Trapped and suffocating, she saw no escape. Until the day they dragged him into town, a captured Apache warrior, proud and unbroken even in chains. His name was Kael, and in his defiant eyes she saw not a savage but a mirror to her own caged soul. The late afternoon sun bled across the horizon, painting the Dragoon Mountains in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. For Grace Dawson, however, the beauty of the landscape had become a cruel mockery. Every vista, every familiar bend in the creek was a memory of Eli. It had been 6 months since the rockslide took him during a cattle drive, shattering her world as completely as the stones had shattered his body. The Bishop Creek Ranch was their dream, carved from unforgiving land by Eli's sweat and her resolve. It was a sprawling testament to a love that had been as steady and life-giving as the creek that gave it its name. Now it was a gilded cage, and the man holding the key was Deputy Gus Ford. Gus Ford had been Eli's deputy before Sheriff Buck Malone, a man worn down by age and apathy, had given Gus the promotion he'd always coveted. Gus moved with the coiled grace of a predator, his smile a thin, bloodless line that never reached his pale blue eyes. He'd always looked at Grace in a way that made her skin crawl, a simmering possessiveness that had been unsettling when Eli was alive and was now utterly terrifying. He sat across from her at the heavy oak table Eli had built, his dusty hat placed deliberately on its polished surface. He'd ridden out uninvited, as he often did now. "It's a hard world for a woman alone, Grace," he said, his voice low, gravelly, pretending to show sympathy. "Ranch this size, it needs a man's hand. Creditors are getting restless," he continued. "I heard Hank Dobbs and Tucson are calling in all his notes." Grace's hands clenched in her lap. "The ledgers are balanced, Gus. Eli was meticulous. We have no outstanding notes with Hank Dobbs," she said. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before being replaced by that same predatory smile. Memories play tricks on a grieving mind. "I've seen the paperwork myself, signed by Eli, a substantial sum." He leaned forward, the smell of cheap whiskey and dust clinging to him. "But I can make it all go away. I can protect you, protect this place." The air grew thick, heavy with the unspoken. This was the third time he had approached her with this veiled threat. Each time his words inched closer to the edge of an abyss she was terrified to look into. "I don't need your protection," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Don't you—" He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "There are whispers about the Apache. They're getting bold again, raiding north of the border. What would you do, Grace, if they came over that ridge one night? Who would be here to stop them from burning this place to the ground and taking you for their own?" The threat was clear, wrapped in a thin veneer of concern. He was the danger, not some distant tribe. He was the one circling, waiting to pick the bones of her life clean. "I want to see this paperwork," she demanded, standing abruptly. Gus stood as well, his height casting a long shadow over her in the fading light. He moved around the table, closing the distance between them. "All in good time, Grace. There's a simpler way. A union. A partnership." "Mrs. Grace Ford," he said with a grin. "It has a nice ring to it. Gives you standing, gives you security." He reached out his fingers, brushing a stray strand of her dark hair. She flinched as if he wasn't even there. "Don't be a fool, Grace. Eli is gone. He can't help you now. I'm the law in this valley. What I say goes. You think Sheriff Buck Malone will stand up to me? You think anyone will question a debt I present them?" He was right. Sheriff Buck Malone was a hollowed-out man who found his courage at the bottom of a bottle. The other ranchers were too scared of Gus or too wrapped up in their own struggles to intervene. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. "This ranch will belong to my husband," she said, her voice a desperate whisper. "It will belong to Eli's son." It was Elias' shield she threw up without thinking. She wasn't with child. Eli had died before that blessing could be granted. Gus's expression tightened into something truly ugly. "Is that so? Well, a child needs a father, a legal guardian. I can be that man. Or I can be the man who forecloses on his mother and throws her out onto the dust with nothing but the clothes on her back." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "You have until the end of the week to give me an answer. But we both know what it will be." He turned and walked out, his spurs ringing a death knell on the wooden porch. Grace sank into the chair, the strength leaving her legs. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out the window at the land she was about to lose. Grace Dawson's heart hammered in her chest as she stared out the window at the land she was about to lose. She was a prisoner in her own home, and the warden had just locked the final door. She would have to marry the man she despised to save the legacy of the man she loved. It was a bargain with the devil, and she knew with a chilling certainty that the price would be her soul. 3 days later, the town of Redemption was buzzing with a cruel, feverish energy. Grace had written in for supplies, forcing herself through the motions of a normal life. The weight of Gus Ford's ultimatum pressed down on her with every breath. She was avoiding his office, delaying the inevitable moment she would have to surrender. Then she saw the crowd gathered in front of the sheriff's office and jail. A cloud of dust on the main road resolved into a group of riders, a posse led by Gus Ford. He rode tall in the saddle chest, puffed out like a conquering hero in his own mind. Behind him, tied to his saddle horn by a thick rope, a man stumbled on foot. He was Apache. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. He was tall and powerfully built, his bare chest and arms slick with sweat, streaked with dirt and blood. His long black hair was matted, but his head was held high. His hands were bound tightly in front of him, the rope chafing his wrists raw. He didn't beg or plead or show any sign of fear. He simply walked with a stride as steady as the unforgiving terrain he was forced across. "Caught this one red-handed Gus," bellowed to the gathering crowd of shopkeepers and drifters. "Him and 2 others tried to run off with a dozen of my horses. The other 2 weren't so lucky." He patted the colt at his hip, a smug declaration of his victory. The townspeople jeered and spat. Grace felt a wave of nausea. She watched as Gus dismounted and yanked hard on the rope, forcing the captive to his knees in the dirt. The man didn't cry out. He absorbed the impact, his jaw tight, his dark eyes sweeping over the hostile faces with pure, unadulterated contempt. Then his eyes found hers. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. The noise of the crowd, the oppressive heat, the stink of dust and sweat, it all vanished. In his gaze, she didn't see a savage or a horse thief. She saw a fierce, defiant pride. She saw a soul that refused to be broken, a spirit that would not kneel even when his body was forced to. It was everything she felt she was losing in herself. A spark of recognition of shared captivity passed between them. He was in chains of rope and iron. She was in chains of coercion and fear. The moment was shattered when Gus kicked the man's legs out from under him. "Get him inside, chain him to the wall. I want to make an example of this one." 2 deputies, rough and eager, hauled the warrior to his feet and dragged him into the jailhouse. Gus, basking in the town's praise, caught sight of Grace standing by the general store. His predatory smile returned, wider and more confident than ever. He strode over to her, his spurs kicking up little puffs of dust. "You see, Grace," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I'm the man who brings order, the man who protects what is his. This is what happens to those who cross me." He was talking about the warrior, but the message was for her. "What will happen to him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The federal marshal will come for him in a week or 2. He'll be sent to a reservation prison down in Florida, a place where they send the worst of them." He'll never see these mountains again. He gestured back toward the jail. He is nothing a wild animal in a cage, but a useful one. His capture solidifies my position here. Makes people feel safe, she thought. Makes them feel afraid, she added silently. That's what you want. Have you considered my proposal? Gus asked, his tone shifting from public bravado to private intimidation. Grace looked past him at the dark, gaping doorway of the jail, where the captive had disappeared. She thought of his eyes, the fire that burned in them. A tiny, dangerous ember of defiance began to glow within her chest. It was foolish. It was suicidal. But it was there. She couldn't save herself. Not yet. But the sight of that Apache warrior had changed something. He had shown her that a body could be chained, while a spirit remained free. She had to survive. To keep the ranch, to honor Eli, she had to play the part. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she met Gus's triumphant gaze. Yes, she said the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. I accept your proposal. Gus's smile was a victor's leer. He had won. He had broken her. He reached out and took her hand, his grip possessive and cold. A wise decision. We'll be married by the circuit judge at the end of the sentence. Grace glanced back one last time at the jail. She felt no relief, no security. She only felt the cold certainty that she had just traded one cage for another, much larger one. And inside that first cage sat a warrior who in one silent glance had shown her the true meaning of the freedom she had just signed away. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of stifling preparations. Gus Ford was an unwelcome presence at the ranch, bossing around the ranch hands with a sense of ownership that made Grace Dawson's teeth grind. He'd brought fabric from Tucson for a wedding dress she didn't want, ordered barrels of whiskey for a celebration she dreaded, and acted every bit the lord of the manor. 2 days before the ceremony, he arrived with a wagon. In the back, chained at the wrists and ankles, was Kael. Grace froze on the porch, a pail of water slipping from her numb fingers. What's he doing here? She whispered to herself. Sheriff Buck Malone is a sentimental old fool, Gus sneered, dismounting. Doesn't have the stomach for holding an Apache warrior. What if his tribe comes to break him out? She asked, already knowing the answer. Gus chuckled darkly. I figured I'll keep him here in your barn. Chained up tight, of course. It's the most secure place for miles. It was a lie. The jail was more secure than any wooden barn. This was a power play, a grotesque display of his dominion over all things in his sight, including Grace and his captive. He was bringing his trophy to his new castle. He'll work. Gus continued, yanking Kael out of the wagon. The warrior landed solidly on his feet, his gaze immediately finding Grace unreadable and intense. The federal marshal isn't due for another week at least. No sense letting good muscle go to waste. He can mend those fences by the south pasture, under guard, naturally, Gus added. It was monstrous to force this man into slave labor on the very land his people likely once roamed free. But any protest would be met with immediate retaliation from Gus. So she remained silent, her face a stoic mask, as Gus and one of his thuggish deputies, a man named Cole Harlan, shoved Kael toward the barn. For the next 2 days, Kael became a silent chained fixture on her horizon. From the kitchen window, she watched him. Under the brutal sun, he worked splitting logs, resetting fence posts, his movements efficient and powerful despite the heavy chains that linked his ankles. Cole Harlan sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, a rifle across his lap, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. Grace found herself making excuses to be outside, tending to her small vegetable garden, weeding the flower beds near the house, all the while observing him. He never spoke. He never looked toward his guard. But sometimes when he thought no one was watching, he would pause, his head lifting slightly as he stared at the distant Dragoon Mountains, his expression a mask of profound aching loss. On the afternoon before the wedding, the heat was suffocating. Cole had drunk himself into a stupor under the tree. Gus was in town making the final legal arrangements to consolidate his control over her property. Grace saw her chance carrying a dipper of fresh, cool water from the well. She walked with feigned nonchalance toward the south pasture. Kael was straining to lift a heavy cedar post into place, the muscles in his back and shoulders straining with the effort. Sweat streamed down his face, carving clean paths through the grime. As she approached, he stopped, turning his head slowly. His eyes met hers. He expected a trick or an insult. She stopped a few feet away, extending the dipper. Water. Her voice was quiet. He stared at the dipper, then at her face. For a long moment he did nothing. He was assessing her, looking for a trap. Finally, with a deliberate slowness that was almost painful to watch, he knelt, allowing her to approach without him towering over her. It was a gesture of respect, or perhaps simply practicality. But it struck her deeply. She knelt in front of him, holding the dipper steady as he drank. He drank deeply, his thirst profound. When he finished, he lifted his head, water dripping from his chin. Why, he asked. His voice was a low rap, rough from disuse, but carrying a deep resonance. It was the first word she had ever heard him speak. "No man should work in this heat without water," she replied simply. His eyes searched hers again. This time they lingered on a faint purple-yellow bruise on her forearm, just below the sleeve of her dress. Gus had grabbed her there, the day before, his fingers biting into her flesh when she'd been slow to obey an order. She hadn't even realized it was visible. Kael's gaze flickered from the bruise to her eyes, and in that instant a silent, complete understanding passed between them. He saw it all: the forced marriage, the pretense of Gus's protection, the truth of her captivity. He saw that her chains, though invisible, were just as real as his. His expression, which had been a wall of stoic defiance, softened into something else, not pity, but a kind of fierce empathy. He was no longer looking at a white woman, an enemy. He was looking at a fellow prisoner. He nodded slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement. Then he looked toward the house where the preparations for the wedding feast were underway. "He tries to own the sun and the sky," Kael said, his voice quiet but laced with contempt. "He will fail. Men like him always do. They consume until they are empty." Grace Dawson felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away fiercely. To show weakness now was a luxury she couldn't afford. She simply nodded, took the dipper, and stood. As she walked back toward the house, she could feel Kael's eyes on her. The world hadn't changed. She was still marrying Gus Ford tomorrow. She was still trapped, but she was no longer completely alone in her cage. A storm broke that night. It was a violent, magnificent tempest that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Grace's soul. The wind howled through the eaves of the house, and rain lashed against the window panes like thrown gravel. Thunder cracked overhead, a celestial announcement of the doom that awaited her at dawn. She couldn't sleep. Her wedding dress, a thing of ivory lace and suffocating satin, hung on the wardrobe door like a shroud. In a few hours she would put it on and chain herself to Gus Ford for life. The thought of his touch on their wedding night was a violation so profound it made her physically ill. A particularly violent clap of thunder rattled the house, and in the flash of lightning that followed, she saw the barn, a dark silhouette against the tumultuous sky. He was in there, Kael, chained to a support beam like an animal. A reckless, desperate idea took root in her mind. It was madness, if she were caught, but what more could Gus do to her than he was already doing? Clad only in her thin cotton nightdress, she slipped out the back door. The rain soaked her instantly, plastering her hair to her scalp and turning the yard into a slick morass of mud. The wind tore at her, trying to drive her back, but she pushed on, guided by instinct and the intermittent flashes of lightning. The barn was dark and smelled of hay rain and livestock. She fumbled for the lantern she knew Rosie Turner kept by the door. With trembling fingers, she managed to light it. The small flickering flame pushed back the oppressive darkness. Kael was in the far stall, just as she'd known he would be. He was on his feet, alerted by her entrance. The chains on his wrists were tethered to a thick iron ring bolted to the central beam. He stood as tall as the chain would allow his body, tense, his eyes burning in the lantern light. "The storm woke you," he stated. It wasn't a question. "The storm is not what keeps me awake," she answered, her voice trembling slightly from the cold and fear. She held the lantern up the light, casting long, dancing shadows. She approached slowly, stopping just outside the reach of his chains. They stood in silence for a moment. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain on the roof and the howl of the wind. "Tomorrow," she finally whispered the word, a confession of defeat. "He will be my husband." Kael's expression was grim. "I saw the priest arrive this evening. A man who smells of fear and whiskey. He will not protect you. No one can." The despair in her own voice shocked her. This was the first time she had admitted it aloud. "This land," she continued, "it was my husband's. Eli Boone. He was a good man. This ranch is all I have left of him. Gus Ford will take it if I don't submit. So you trade your body to save the dirt," he said, not with judgment but with a stark clarity that cut through her justifications. "It's more than dirt," she flared, stung. "It's a legacy. It's the only home I have ever known. It is my husband's memory," she added, her voice shaking. "A memory is not saved by dishonoring yourself." Kael's voice grew low and intense. "The land does not care who holds the deed. Your spirit does. His spirit does. He would not want this for you." Grace began to weep silent, racking sobs that shook her entire body. All the grief, all the fear, all the rage she had bottled up for months came pouring out. She sank to her knees in the hay, the lantern resting beside her, her face buried in her hands. She felt rather than saw him move. He knelt, the chains clinking softly, bringing himself as close to her as he could. He was just a few feet away, a chained prisoner in the dark. And yet in that moment, he was the only source of strength in her world. "He wants an heir," she choked out, forcing the ugliest truth into the open, "to secure his claim. Not just to the land, but to me. He wants to own my future, to plant his seed in Eli's soil and call it his own." Kael was silent for a long time. The storm raged outside, a wild counterpoint to the raw, painful stillness in the barn. When he spoke again, his voice was transformed. It was no longer just the voice of a captive, but of a warrior making a declaration of war. "No," he said, the single word imbued with unbreakable certainty. Kael's voice was low, full of quiet power. "No," he said, his words filled with an unshakable certainty. Grace Dawson looked up, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the lantern's glow. Kael's eyes were burning with a fire that seemed to hold back the storm itself. "You will go through with this ceremony," he said, his voice firm and urgent. "You will be his wife in name. You will live in his house, but you will not be his. The future he wants, the legacy he thinks he'll build from your womb." "That will be a lie," Kael said, straining against the chains, his gaze locking with hers. "Listen to me. The spirit of a child chooses its parents. It chooses the strength of the mother, the honor of the father. His soul is poison. No life will come from it." Kael leaned forward, the chains taut. "You will survive this, and when the time is right, you will bear a son, a warrior, a legacy of defiance. But he will not be the son of Gus Ford." The unspoken promise hung in the air between them, terrifying and sacred. Kael wasn't just offering comfort. He was making a vow. He was declaring that Gus's ultimate victory, the continuation of his line through her, would be denied. Kael reached out his chained hands, stopping just short of touching her. "You will bear my son, not his." In the heart of the tempest, surrounded by her enemies, a captured warrior gave a terrified widow a reason to fight. It wasn't a promise of love or escape. It was a promise of legacy, of vengeance. A secret pact sealed not with a touch, but with a vow that was more binding than any wedding ring. It was a desperate, insane act of rebellion. And as another bolt of lightning illuminated her face, Grace Dawson, for the first time in months, felt not despair, but the cold, hard glint of hope. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and washed clean by the storm. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and dread. Grace moved like a ghost through the preparations, allowing Rosie Turner, her loyal and sharp-eyed housekeeper, to help her into the ivory dress. "You look like a winter rose, Grace," Rosie said softly, her gnarled fingers fumbling with the tiny buttons. Beautiful but cold. Her dark eyes were full of a pity Grace couldn't bear to see. The ceremony was a brief, hollow affair held in the main room of the ranch house. The circuit judge, a man with tired eyes and a stained coat, mumbled the words as if he were reading a death sentence. Gus Ford stood beside her, his hand gripping her arm tightly, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He smelled of bay rum and triumph. Grace kept her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, a small water stain that looked like a weeping eye. She said the words that were required of her, her voice dead and monotone. When Gus lifted her veil to kiss her, she turned her head just enough that his lips brushed her cheek. His grip on her arm tightened painfully for a second, a silent punishment. The celebration that followed was even worse. Gus's men and a few cowed ranchers from neighboring properties drank his whiskey and ate her food, their laughter loud and coarse. Grace sat beside her new husband, a porcelain doll on display, smiling when he nudged her, speaking only when spoken to. Every moment was a performance. Every breath was a lie. Through it all, her mind was a fortress. She thought of the vow made in the storm. "You will bear my son, not his." The words were a secret talisman, a hidden blade she carried against her heart. Gus, full of whiskey and self-importance, delayed Kael's work schedule. The warrior was kept in the barn, a living symbol of Gus's power for all his guests to see. Several of the drunken men would wander over to the barn to gawk and taunt him, but Kael remained impassive, a granite statue of contempt. Later that evening, as the party thinned and the sky turned a deep star-brewed indigo, Gus grabbed her hand. "It's time, wife." The walk to the master bedroom was the longest of her life. He shut the door behind them, the click of the latch echoing the sound of her cage being locked. He turned to her, his eyes clouded with lust and alcohol. "Finally," he breathed, reaching for the buttons of her dress. Grace's mind went back to the barn, to Kael's plan, whispered in the final moments before she fled back to the house. A desperate, dangerous plan that relied on deception and timing. "Gus," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, Let me make myself ready for you. A wife should be perfect for her husband on their wedding night." Her apparent compliance surprised and pleased him. His suspicious nature was overruled by his arrogance and desire. "Don't be long," he said, already shrugging out of his coat. She fled to the small washing room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. There, hidden behind a loose floorboard, as Rosie had instructed, was a small vial, a potent sleeping draught distilled from herbs Rosie knew from the old country, odorless, tasteless. She poured a generous amount into the glass of whiskey she had carried from the main room. Her hand shook so badly, she nearly spilled the drink. Returning to the bedroom, she found Gus Ford sitting on the edge of the bed, already half undressed. "A drink?" she asked, offering him the glass with a trembling smile. "To our future." He took it without hesitation, his eyes raking over her. "To my heir," he toasted, draining the glass in one long swallow. The minutes that followed were the most agonizing of Grace Dawson's life. He spoke of his plans for the ranch and their future, his words slurring slightly. He pulled her onto his lap, his hands coarse and unwelcome on the fine lace of her dress. She endured it, her body rigid, her mind screaming. She focused on the vow, on the warrior in the barn. Just as his eyes grew heavy, just as his grip on her loosened, he looked at her, a flicker of confusion in his drunken gaze. "You're different," he mumbled. "Eli Boone never tamed you." His head lulled back, and he slumped against the pillow, snoring heavily. Grace scrambled away from him, but gasping for air as if she had just surfaced from drowning. He was out. The first part of the plan had worked. She waited. An hour, then another. The house fell silent. The last of the guests departed. The only sound was Gus Ford's rhythmic, beastly snoring. Slipping out of the heated dress and into a simple dark skirt and blouse, she crept from the room. She moved through the darkened house, a shadow in her own home. In the kitchen, Rosie Turner was waiting with a heavy blanket and a small satchel of food ready. The old woman simply nodded her eyes, saying everything that couldn't be spoken. Grace took the satchel and slipped out into the cool, clean night. The moon was a silver crescent offering just enough light to see. The barn loomed ahead. This was the part of the plan that terrified her most, the consummation of the vow. It was not an act of passion, but of war, a deliberate strategic strike against their common enemy. It was her only hope of planting a seed of truth in a field of lies. She entered the barn, her heart pounding like a wild drum. Kael was waiting awake and alert, as if he had sensed her coming. In the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls, his eyes were dark pools of intensity. She stood before him, the satchel in her hand. She didn't need to speak. He didn't need to ask. They were two soldiers meeting on a battlefield, their purpose clear and absolute. The key, Kael's voice, was a low whisper, the one for my chains. He wears it on a cord around his neck. Grace swallowed hard. I couldn't. He was too. I couldn't risk waking him. A flicker of something, not disappointment, but a recalculation, passed over his face. The plan had been for her to secure the key to free him tonight. It doesn't matter, he said after a moment. The vow is what matters. The rest will follow. He knelt and she came to him. In the silent, hay-scented darkness of the barn, Grace Dawson and the warrior Kael sealed their pact. It was a desperate, solemn act of rebellion, a planting of a secret seed of defiance. It held no tenderness, only a shared grim purpose. They were creating a future, a legacy that would belong to them and them alone, under the very nose of the man who thought he owned them both. When it was done, she retreated just as silently as she had come, leaving him chained in the darkness, the secret of what they had done now a living thing between them. Weeks bled into a month. Life at the Bishop Creek Ranch settled into a tense, unbearable routine. Grace played the part of the dutiful, subdued wife. She ran the household, oversaw the accounts, and endured Gus Ford's presence with a chillingly calm facade. He was a brutish and possessive husband, his mood swinging between smug satisfaction and sudden, violent rages. But the sleeping draught, administered sparingly and cleverly in his nightly whiskey, kept the worst of his physical advances at bay. She lived on a knife's edge, her secret a constant humming terror in her veins. Kael remained a prisoner, his transfer to the federal marshal mysteriously and repeatedly delayed by Gus. It suited Gus to have him there, a constant reminder of his power. Kael worked the ranch under the lazy eye of a rotating guard, his silence and dignity an ongoing affront to his captor. His and Grace's paths rarely crossed directly, but they communicated in stolen glances across the dusty yard, a shared look of resolve, a slight nod of encouragement. They were co-conspirators in the slowest, most dangerous escape imaginable. Then two things happened that ripped the fragile tapestry of their deception apart. The first was the morning sickness. It came upon Grace suddenly and violently. She managed to hide it for a week, but one morning at breakfast, she was forced to flee the table. Gus watched her go, a slow, calculating look dawning on his face. When she returned, pale and shaken, he was smiling. It was not a pleasant smile. "Well, well," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It seems my heir is eager to make his presence known." Grace's blood ran cold. The timing was plausible. It had been just over a month since the wedding. Grace Dawson forced a weak smile, murmuring something non-committal. But Gus Ford was triumphant. He became even more insufferably arrogant, bragging to his men, already naming the unborn child a son, of course, after himself. His obsession with his legacy was now fulfilled. But the second event was a discovery. Gus had been called away to Tucson for 2 days on territorial business. It was a blessed, desperately needed reprieve. Seizing the opportunity, Grace searched his office. She didn't know what she was looking for, proof of his fraudulent claims on her land, perhaps. She sifted through ledgers and deeds, her fingers dusty from old paper. In a locked drawer at the bottom of his desk, she found a small tin box. After several minutes of frantic work, with a letter opener, she pried it open. Inside was not legal paperwork, but personal effects. A few yellowed photographs, a tarnished silver dollar, and a small bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. The letters were from a doctor, Doc Harper in St. Louis, dated 6 years prior. Grace's eyes scanned the elegant spidery script, and the words leapt out at her. The mumps you suffered as a young man were a particularly severe case. As I explained, the resulting fever often has unfortunate and permanent consequences. I must be frank, Mr. Gus Ford. The chances of you ever siring a child are for all practical purposes non-existent. I am truly sorry to be the bearer of such news. Grace sank to the floor, the letters sterile and cold in her hands. His obsession with an heir, his taunts about her bearing his son. It was all a monstrous, elaborate lie. A charade to solidify his claim, to cement his ownership of her and the ranch through a child he would claim as his own. A child he knew could never be his. He hadn't been trying to create a legacy. He had been trying to steal one. The nausea that rose in her had nothing to do with her pregnancy. It was the bile of pure, unadulterated hatred. That night she went to the barn. Rosie Turner stood watch her face, a grim mask. Inside, Grace told Kael everything. She showed him the letters, her hand shaking as she held the lantern close so he could see the words. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his powerful form radiating a lethal stillness. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place for him, just as they had for her. This is his weakness, Kael said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. A liar's greatest fear is the truth. A barren man's greatest shame is his due. The danger had escalated beyond anything they had imagined. When her pregnancy became undeniable, Gus would have a choice. He could pretend the child was his, living his lie. Or if he ever suspected the truth of its parentage, his humiliation and rage would be boundless. He would not hesitate to kill her and the child. He would kill Kael without a second thought. "We have to get you away from here," Grace whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Now, before he returns." "No, Kael," said, his certainty absolute. "If I run, he will hunt me, and his anger will fall on you and Rosie. He will know. He will suspect. We do not run. We cut the snake's head off." How she cried, her composure cracking. "He is the law." "He has us in chains," Kael said, his eyes boring into hers. "You were afraid to take it before. You cannot be afraid now. His life and the life of our son depends on it." He laid out a new plan born of stark necessity. It was simple, brutal, and had no room for error. When Gus Ford returned from Tucson the next day, Grace Dawson was a different woman. The fear was still there, but it had been forged into a cold, hard resolve. She greeted him with a kiss to the cheek, a gesture so unexpected it momentarily startled him. She played the part of the glowing, expectant mother, discussing the nursery, asking his opinions, feeding his monstrous ego. That night she prepared his favorite meal. She laced his whiskey with a double dose of the sleeping draught. She needed him deeply unconscious. She sat with him, feigning adoration, until his head slumped onto the table. With her heart hammering so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs, she reached for the leather cord around his neck. Her fingers brushed his hot, whiskey-scented skin. The key was small and iron. Untying the knot, she slipped it from his neck. It felt impossibly heavy in her palm, the weight of their future. Clutching the key, she fled to the barn. The moon was high and bright, painting the yard in shades of silver and black. She found Kael waiting, not in his usual spot, but by the stall door. He had used a piece of stone to painstakingly wear down the iron pin in the hinge. Over the past weeks, a task of unimaginable patience and foresight. He was free of the stall, but not free from his chains. Grace Dawson thrust the key into his hand. "Go," she whispered. "Go now. Get as far away as you can before dawn." Kael took the key but made no move to unlock his shackles. He looked at her, his expression grim. "He will wake. He will find the key gone. He will know you helped me. What will he do to you?" "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But it's your only chance." "No," Kael said, his voice resolute. "It is our only chance." He unlocked the heavy manacles from his wrists and ankles, dropping them into the hay with a soft thud. He stretched, rolling his shoulders, feeling the freedom in his limbs for the first time in months. He was no longer a captive. He was a warrior. "He does not expect a fight here," Kael said, his eyes turning toward the ranch house where Gus Ford slept. "He believes his walls protect him. We will not run. We will bring the reckoning to him." He was not going to flee into the night. He was going to stay. He was going to face the man who had chained him, who had threatened his child, and the woman who carried him. The final bloody chapter of their story was about to be written, not in the mountains or across the territory, but right here in the heart of Gus Ford's stolen kingdom. The ranch house was eerily silent as they crept back inside. Rosie Turner met them at the kitchen door, her face etched with fear, but her eyes steady. She held out a heavy cast-iron skillet. "For the snake," she whispered, her voice trembling. Grace took it, its weight solid and cold in her hands. Kael moved with a silence that was unnerving. He was a phantom gliding through the familiar rooms of her home. He paused in the main room, his eyes falling on the gun rack by the fireplace. He ignored the rifles, instead picking up the long, wicked-looking Bowie knife that had belonged to Gus Ford's predecessor. He tested its weight, its balance. A grim satisfaction settled on his features. They found Gus Ford still slumped at the dining table, snoring in his drugged stupor. The plan was simple: bind him and wait for him to wake. They would force a confession from him about the fraudulent debts and the land grab in front of Sheriff Buck Malone, whom Rosie had been dispatched to fetch with a story of a terrible accident. But the devil, it seemed, had his own luck. As Kael approached, Gus's eyes fluttered open. The double dose of the draft had been potent, but his years of heavy drinking had given him a formidable tolerance. He wasn't fully conscious, but his instincts screamed danger. His blurry gaze fell on Grace, holding the skillet, and then on the unchained warrior standing over him, knife in hand. A guttural roar of pure rage erupted from his throat. He wasn't thinking. He was reacting. With a surge of adrenaline, he kicked the heavy table, sending it crashing into Kael's legs. Dishes shattered. The lantern fell, its oil spilling across the wooden floor. Gus Ford scrambled backward, his hand fumbling for the pistol at his hip. "You treacherous bitch!" he screamed at Grace, his face a mask of contorted fury. "And you, I'll gut you, you filthy savage!" Kael recovered his balance, sidestepping the overturned table. He moved not with haste, but with a lethal, focused grace. He was a predator, and Gus Ford was his prey. But Gus was a cornered rat. He got his pistol free and fired the shot, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet tore a splintered gouge in the wall just past Kael's head. Before he could fire again, Kael lunged not at Gus, but at the lantern. With a swift kick, he sent the smoldering lantern sliding across the floor, its flame igniting the spilled oil. A wall of fire erupted between them, the flames spreading with terrifying speed, licking up the dry wooden walls of the home Eli Boone had built. Smoke billowed thick and acrid. "The letters!" Grace screamed, her mind snapping to the one piece of evidence that could destroy Gus. They were in the desk drawer in his office. "Get out!" Kael yelled. His eyes fixed on Gus, who was now using the fire as a shield, trying to get a clear shot. "Go now!" But Grace couldn't leave. This was her fight too. This was the monster who had tried to steal her life, her legacy. As Gus raised his pistol again, aiming through a gap in the flames, Grace acted on pure instinct. She hefted the heavy iron skillet and threw it with all her might. The skillet spun through the smoky air, catching Gus square in the side of the head. The shot went wide, shattering a window. He staggered, stunned, dropping his pistol. It was the opening Kael needed. He vaulted over the burning edge of a rug, a wraith emerging from the smoke and fire. He crashed into Gus, and the two men went down in a brutal tangle of limbs. Grace choked on the smoke, her eyes watering. The fire was everywhere now, consuming her home, consuming her past. Grace Dawson scrambled for the office, the heat scorching her skin. She yanked open the drawer, grabbed the tin box with the letters, and turned to flee. The main room was an inferno. Through the roaring flames, she could see the two men locked in a primal, desperate struggle. Gus Ford was bigger, heavier, but Kael was faster, stronger, fueled by months of righteous fury. The glint of the Bowie knife flashed, followed by a strangled cry. Then Kael rose from the smoke, his chest heaving, blood dripping from a gash on his arm. Gus Ford lay still on the floor, the fire beginning to consume the edges of his coat. He would be found in the ashes, a victim of a tragic fire, his pistol beside him. No one would question it. Kael grabbed Grace's arm. "We have to go." They burst out onto the porch, just as the roof began to groan, ready to collapse. They stumbled into the yard, gulping the clean night air, watching as the Bishop Creek ranch house was devoured by flames. Everything Eli Boone had built, everything she had fought to protect, was turning to ash. But as she stood there, the tin box clutched to her chest, she felt not loss, but a strange, fierce sense of liberation. The house was gone, but the land remained. The loveless marriage was over. The lies were burned away. Headlights cut through the darkness. A buggy was racing up the road. It was Sheriff Buck Malone, roused by a frantic Rosie Turner. Kael looked at Grace, then at the approaching buggy, and then toward the dark silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains. There was no place for him here, not now. He was an escaped federal prisoner, and the man he'd killed was a deputy. There would be questions, a manhunt. He touched her cheek, his fingers gentle. "Raise him to be a warrior," he whispered. "Tell him of the mountains. Where will you go?" She asked, her heart aching. "Home," he said, simply. He squeezed her arm one last time, a silent promise, and then melted into the darkness, as silent and swift as he had been in the house. By the time Sheriff Buck Malone pulled his weary horse to a stop, Kael was gone. The sheriff found a hysterical widow, a burned-down house, and the charred remains of his deputy. Grace, weeping, told him a story of a terrible accident, a lantern overturned, a drunken fight. It was a story he was all too willing to believe. It was simpler that way. The investigation was short, the conclusion foregone. Armed with the doctor's letters she found in the wreckage, Grace Dawson proved Gus Ford's fraudulent claims to be a desperate sham. The debts vanished. The land was hers, free and clear. She had lost her home, but she had won her life, and inside her, the vow was taking root, a new legacy born, not of a loveless marriage, but of a pact made in darkness and sealed in fire. The future of Bishop Creek would not belong to a bishop or a row. It would belong to a warrior's son. In the months that followed, Grace Dawson, with the help of Rosie Turner and a few loyal hands, began to rebuild. Not the old house, but a smaller, stronger cabin on a rise overlooking the creek. She was no longer just a widow. She was the master of her own land, her own destiny. When spring came, she gave birth to a son. He had her eyes, but his hair was as black as a raven's wing, and his spirit was as fierce and unbroken as the mountains that watched over their valley. She named him Chaton, a Sioux word for falcon, a name that honored the warrior who had vanished back into the wild, but whose legacy now thrived. She would raise him to be strong, to be honorable, and to know the story of the vow that gave him life. Her story was not one of a woman who was saved, but of a woman who found the strength to save herself, forging a new future from the ashes of her past. If this story of survival defiance and the creation of a powerful new legacy in the heart of the untamed West resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates tales of unbreakable spirit. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next story from the dust and glory of the American frontier. We have many more legends to tell, and we'd be honored to have you along for the ride. Thank you for listening. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voice-over visual scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.